Hello, folks. Tom Dinas here. Just a little warning before we start today's episode. This contains some upsetting language and some upsetting descriptions of hunger, starvation, and death from World War II. So please be aware before you start this episode. They might be upsetting. Thank you.
Ελληνικέ λαέ, σήμερα τα χαράματα στις 3 η ώρα, ο Ιταλός πρέσβης μου ζήτησε να τους παραδώσω τη γη μας. Μου είπε ακόμα πως αν δεν το κάνω, τα Ιταλικά στρατεύματα θα μας επιτεθούν στις 6 το πρωί. Του απάντησα πως θεωρώ τόσο το αίτημα, όσο και τον τρόπο με τον οποίο γίνεται, σαν κήρυξη πολέμου της Ιταλίας εναντίον της χώρας μας. Ας αποδείξουμε πως είμαστε πράγματι άξιοι των προγόνων μας και της ελευθερίας που μας εξασφάλισαν. Όλο το έθνος ας ξεσηκωθεί σύσσωμο. Ας αγωνιστούμε για την πατρίδα μας, τις γυναίκες μας, τα παιδιά μας, τις ιερές μας παραδόσεις. Ο αγώνας είναι για την ελευθερία και την τιμή μας.
My grandmothers would never throw food away. This little thing that I thought it was the pretext for this episode. But the real reason behind it is that soon, or even when this episode is released, is 28th of October, which is the traditional commemoration of World War II in Greece. And marks the famous όχι or no against the Italians in the request to surrender in 1940. The bit we've just heard was the Greek Prime Minister at the time, and the dictator, of course, Ioannis Metaxas, and he just had rejected the Italian ultimatum for Greece to surrender to them. In a sense, he said, "If we do not do this, the Italian army will attack us tomorrow at 6 in the morning. I said this was a declaration of war. Let's fight for our country, families, and sacred traditions." The Triple Axis occupation of Greece was quite brutal, even by the Nazi standards. The Germans held the big cities of the mainland, but the rebels in the mountainous interior were far from happy with surrendering, and they were inflicting casualties on the enemy. The reprisals of the occupation force was barbaric. Children, elderly, and women in the villages that were accused of collaborating with the rebel Greeks were massacred, executed, burned alive. And not only them, every male was executed too. When I was growing up in Greece, in Veria, in the 80s, my grandparents were part of our everyday lives. We would visit them often and eat with them. Sometimes just us, and sometimes with our parents. But in general, it was something of a normal part of our weekly lives. Their obsession with bread seemed a little too much for us kids. Bread seemed paramount on every meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and it was served plentifully, and we were urged to eat it all and never leave any, or God forbid, throw it away. That was a no-no. Growing up in the 80s, this was a time of plenty. A modern European democracy, fairly newly established for that, Greece, after 1974, which was the last year of the dictatorship. Of course, we hadn't experienced any of this, but my grandparents grew up in deprivation, destruction, and hunger of World War II, the subsequent Civil War, which lasted just as long, and the 50s of rationing, exile, and immigration. Adding to this, the military dictatorship was in the mix in 1967 for 7 years. 7 brutal years, and led to financial ruin for many working classes, of course, the country, and aside of that, there was torture, exile, imprisonment, and deaths of anyone who was there was a mere suspicion of them being left-leaning or had social conscience. So, for my grandparents, bread was sacred, important, paramount, symbolic, filling up stomachs, keeping hunger at bay, saving lives. Even dry, stale bread. My grandmother, from my mother's side, would talk about the occupation in World War II, that they used to eat stale bread, dipped in water to soften it, and sprinkled with the dregs of Greek coffee and maybe some sugar to make it more palatable. There was no butter, of course, not even olive oil to be eaten with it. Everyone was hungry. This was her mantra almost on a daily basis when she was serving us our lunch with a massive slice of white bread, even though we didn't want it necessarily with our lunch. If you have chips and meatballs or something similar, or chicken and potatoes, you don't want bread as well. You want to enjoy your food. But she would insist we have it. We have to have it to fill us up so we won't be hungry. Of course, we were naughty 90s and 80s kids and would point out to the full saucepan of food that we can eat or to the fridge full of stuff that also can be eaten. The townsfolk across Greece during the Axis occupation suffered from severe hunger and malnutrition, especially in the winters of 1941 and 1942. The situation was even worse in the biggest cities, like Athens. My other grandmother, from my father's side, she was in a relatively small village in the mountainous interior, and there, with the Italian occupation, which was lighter and less harsh, in addition to the extended family's livestock and small holdings, the hunger was less severe. But it was always a threat, because poverty, especially for craftsmen and middle classes, was more acute. You see, it was wartime. No construction could occur, and the hyperinflation pushed prices out of the reach of people who didn't grow their own produce. Let's listen from my yaya, grandmother in Greek, about her own memories from World War II, when she was up in the village.
Της πείνα στον καιρό, του 41-42 που ήταν η πείνα, θυμάμαι. Είχαμε μια οικογένεια.
In the time of the hunger, in 41 and 42, there was a family from the Skati, the main village in the area, and the father was a craftsman and a builder. And he didn't have a job, of course. No one was building houses at the time. And his kids would run down by the stream, under the bridge, and grab some wild greens or nettles, and would put them on a flat rock, sprinkle them with some salt if they had some, and hit them with another rock, and crush them to soften them up. They'd find this tasty, delicious even. The local farmers would give them as much as they could, some bread, some flour, whenever they would see them, or on occasion, whatever else they had on hand. That's how people survived in the occupation. That, and probably snails, the people would roast them with some salt on the ashes.
Σαλιγκάρια δεν τα τρώγαμε τόσο πολύ, αλλά...
Πεινούσανε στο δάσος
Ναι. Όχι. Τα σαλιγκάρια μπορούσαν να τα ψήσουν και στο χόβολι, έτσι, ζέστη. Με το ψήσιμο αυτό να ανοίγουν και τα βγάζεις με το κοτάλι ύστερα και με τα λάτι τρώγονται. Είναι ωραία, γίνονται ωραία. Αλλά επειδή δεν τα συνηθίζουμε... Μεγαλώσαμε κι εμείς. Ήρθε ο Ιταλικός ο πόλεμος, ήρθε ο Γερμανικός ο πόλεμος, φύγανε οι Γερμανοί το...
We were teenagers then, my grandmother and her siblings. The Italian war came. Italy, as I said, tried to invade in 1940s Greece through Albania, not very far away from where my grandma grew. Then the Germans, they left 23rd of November, I think, in 1944. The Italians had long gone by that point, and the Greek rebel resistance army brought some Italian war prisoners with them in the village, moving them about with them, up in the mountains, down again when the enemy was away, but most of them died eventually from hunger and hardships.
Πεθάνανε και αυτοί, οι περισσότεροι πεθάνανε. Ερχόταν εκεί ένας, ήταν ράφτης, εγώ είχα ραφτομηχανή και έρχονταν και γάζουνε τα παντελόνια των συμπατριωτών του.
The people came out on the balconies and shouted, "Please let this war end." We sold all our stuff for a piece of stale crust of bread, and we didn't even eat that bread. In Britain, of course, you had your own rationing, which in the end lasted, as far as I remember, for 14 years. The government put lots of measures in place to control this. Reduced waste, reduced meat consumption, people had to grow their own vegetables, the Dig for Victory campaign, and so on, kept millions of Britons alive. People were given coupons. If I'm not mistaken, there were 16 coupons per month to use for more luxurious items such as sugar, rice, biscuits, and so on. But rationing in a war-occupied Greece wasn't even an option as there was no food. So how did that happen? And why was it allowed to such an extent, countrywide, to such a degree? Firstly, the Axis powers imposed reconstruction fees, meaning the Greek people had to pay for the cost of being invaded. The coffers of the Greek state in the 1930s were low to start with. So food and material, any material, were taken, crops and anything else valuable. The Nazis looted foodstuff and deprived the population of basic food. Lack of food was made even worse by the Allies, unfortunately. The Allied forces, in order to starve the Nazis, had imposed a naval blockade, and food wasn't coming in for Greek families either. The Great Famine was the result. By winter of 1941, starvation was acute and thousands died. The graveyards were overflowing. Desperation and fear engulfed all aspects of life. Death was everywhere. The toll is hard to measure accurately, but it's around 150,000, many experts say, while others estimate the numbers to be double or more. People reduced to scavenging in the rubbish heaps. Thousands were dying in the streets. The winter was brutal. The lack of food and the disease killed thousands, as I said earlier. There are quotes for numbers as high as 400,000.
United Press International Bureau Chief George Androulidakis lived through this.
Occupation meant for Greece first starvation. When I say starvation, it was real starvation. Starvation was the picture of every day in the street, running up into people whom you thought were in an absolutely good condition. They're even fat. You thought they were fat. They were swollen from lack of vitamins, and all of a sudden they would crumble down, and a cart would pick them up and take them away to this nearest cemetery to bury them. At that time, the surrounding of Athens was full of people trying to gather wild greens and take them home for the dinner. The spectacle, particularly of little children, slimmed to bones, was simply awful. Well, another characteristic of the occupation was the cruelty of the occupying forces, especially of the Germans.
Laird Archer, who worked for an American aid agency and was in Athens when the Germans entered the city on 27th of April 1941, noted in his journal, April 28th, the wholesale looting of Athens has begun. Remaining food and fuel reserves have been taken first. A staff member found the entire market sealed under the swastika. The Germans have emptied all public fuel tanks. A marathon farmer, who made his way in today to report that our nurses were safe in the hills, said that his flocks of poultry, even the pigeons, have been machine-gunned and the swastika planted at the four corners of his field. He had been warned to take nothing from the fields on pain of death. The invaders have been taking meat, cattle and sheep north of the city for some days now, and reserve the dairy herds in the environs of Athens for their own use. My friends in the Ministry of Agriculture estimate that 200,000 tons domestic supply may be cut to a third by the slaughtering. Up in the north, in Thessaloniki, things weren't better. The vibrant Jewish community of Thessaloniki disappeared. Most died in the concentration camps. In July 1942, all Jewish male citizens were ordered to the main square of the town. By December, the majority had been deported to Auschwitz, and by the end of the war, most of them had died in the concentration camps. All over Greece, but especially in Athens and the islands, the starvation and the hunger had reached such levels that people were reduced to eating hedgehogs, donkeys, not that the Germans have left many, and even turtles, animals normally that would never have been touched. Wild greens were paramount to everyone's diet. So people were urged to eat greens and chew them slowly so that the stomach would think it was full. These greens included spring greens, wild rocket, wild asparagus, wild chard, mallow leaves, and nettles. Instructions such as carefully collect the crumbs from the table and put them in a glass. At the end of the week, you will have collected enough crumbs to use in your cooking. were very prevalent at the time. A recipe of the occupation goes like this. Potato peel fritters. Wash the potatoes well and boil them. Peel. Take the peels, finely chop lots of onions, a bit of mint, salt and pepper. Fry. From the book of Natalia Samara, we have the following description of daily life in the streets of Athens during the German occupation. Women, men, children, human skeletons dressed in rags, search desperately in the garbage to find something to eat and satisfy their hunger. An onion peel, a lemon wedge, or a bone to lick. Dead bodies on every corner, an everyday sight. The situation is no better on the islands. With the disruption of transport due to the requisitioning of ships and the lack of fuel, even basic food items are running out. Hermoupoli, the beautiful, relatively rich upper-class capital of Syros Island, a large city on a small island, is paying a heavy death toll. 8,500 dead out of 24,000 residents. Wealthy people had to sell their possessions to buy olive oil, cheese, and meat. My grandmother, from my mother's side, who grew up in the town of Veria, as I said, she was talking, not with the best words you can understand, about a bread called bobota. As I mentioned earlier, for her and her family, the war famine was a lot more acute than on my father's side of family. So bobota was a bread made by a porridge-like mixture of corn flour, hot water and salt. That would be cooked or baked in a tray on the fire to make basic bread, dense, to fill up the empty bellies. In later years, after the occupation and the civil war had ended, bobota came to be despised by the people as the bread of the poor. Grandma also used to say all they had for usable fat was sesame oil, not the good, healthy, delicious olive oil they were used to before. She seemed to despise that too. And throughout my childhood, by osmosis I did too. In my university years in UK, where I ate first time on my own and cooked my own food and did my own food shopping in supermarkets and saw sesame oil for sale, I felt a great deal of confusion as to why would one do this voluntarily to themselves. I use sesame oil because I grew up thinking it was really, really bad. Proper white wheat bread was rationed from May 1941, alongside rice, sugar, meat and olive oil. By September, there was nothing really to ration. Everything was sold in the black market. Street cats were sold as rabbits for a gold coin, or the farmers in the countryside would hide their own produce so they wouldn't sell it for pennies to the occupying forces, and so they would survive during the winter. The city people had no food. The Great Famine of 41 and 42 was exacerbated by one of the most savage winters, with the thermometer dropping to -6 degrees Celsius and contributing to the decimation of the population. Athens was starving and freezing. The snow lasted for 2 weeks, and in the center of the city, in the Pedion of Areos, a public park, it reached 1 meter. The Athenians had not seen such a winter in over 80 years. Two things slightly alleviated the problem, the massive problem: retsina and raisins. Retsina, of course, is the Greek raisin wine, pine resin wine, which was despised by the Nazis, so they didn't drink it compared to the rest of the wine. And raisins themselves were relatively in abundance. They were used to sweeten everything and bulk all foods, savory dishes as well as sweet ones. On the eve of their defeat, the German Nazis were equally brutal during the retreat. They've destroyed rail stations, railways, bridges. They burned and looted, and they left just scorched earth behind them. So as the Allies won't catch them up, the situation was desperate. The country was left completely in ruins. Huge debt, the coffers empty, hyperinflation, and the whole countryside ravaged by 4 years of continuous war. As I said, hundreds of thousands of rebels and resistant forces were founding all over Greece in the countryside and countrywide against the occupying forces. So the war never really stopped. All the infrastructure of the country was lying in ruins. In modern Greek vernacular language, The word occupation is synonymous with famine and hunger due to the extremely harsh situation the Greek population faced during all those years of World War II. Stockpiling unnecessary amounts of food and an irrational fear upon seeing an empty pantry is still colloquially called occupation syndrome by many Greeks, especially grandmothers. Since these behaviors were especially common during the post-war years, the financial crisis that hit Greece in 2010, alongside with the punitive economic measures from the EU and the austerity policies that followed for at least 7 years, they brought all these memories back from deep down the Greek psyche. The austerity and the prices made everybody hark back to tips and tricks and measures that people used to take to alleviate hunger, to survive with simpler foods and save money and fuel. And of course, had reawakened the animosity against the occupying forces. Again, it seemed like the Germans were to blame. So all this memory of occupation and famine hasn't really gone away even today. Of course, the problem of today, they have many different varieties, and the hardships that people endured during the long austerity period in many ways can be compared to a war-like economy. But of course, there are many, many differences and many, many other problems that are global as well. And for a small country like Greece, can be felt into much bigger degree, at least for a bigger majority of the population. So this episode was as much about austerity food, hunger and famine, but also a big chunk of what shaped modern Greece's history and the way we are today. It's not exactly enjoyable episode, but I hope it gave you some more insights about us as people. So that's it for this week. And if you want to ask any questions, or you have any suggestions or points that you want to make, please get in touch at the Delicious Legacy Podcast at gmail.com, all one word. And of course on Blue Sky or Instagram or on Patreon if you are a member there. And of course everyone is welcome to ask me anything, and I'm eagerly awaiting your comments, as I do believe I genuinely learn a lot from people's new ideas and suggestions and the way they think about things. So please, get in touch. Finally, this podcast cannot exist without your generous support, so you can support the podcast at ko-fi.com with one-off donations or with monthly subscription, and basically you can help me work more on the podcast and researching, writing, producing, editing and mixing. I do hope you enjoy this podcast. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcast from, and share it with some friends and family and colleagues, or in a WhatsApp group or in a Facebook page. And the podcasts are all about food and history and traditions and how all relate to our modern day and age. Thanks for listening. I've been Thomas Dinas, and this was the Delicious Legacy Podcast. Love you lots. Bye.